2 Samuel chapter 5 concluded with David's second and more decisive victory over the Philistines. Now, the Philistines had been much more than a thorn in Israel's side for the past 3 centuries. They had prevented Israel from living peacefully enough to be able to establish nation status within its sovereign borders. Now, the Holy Scriptures often present some of the greatest history-changing events, but usually it's done in the most subdued way. It was and remains Jehovah's pattern that whatever the nations observed as their customs and their social conventions and their religious practices, the customs and social conventions and religious practices observed by the members of God's kingdom would be different, often even the opposite. The victorious Gentile kings of old had teams of writers who would record and embellish every detail of each military victory, often even turning a draw or a loss into a win, and usually for the purpose of glorifying and crediting the king for his godlike invincibility. Therefore, even the most resounding Israelite triumphs in battle are usually recorded with little detail, not much fanfare, and the battle leader is mentioned only as a matter of record. And this is because when Israel obtained a great victory, it was to be seen as a triumph of Israel's God, more than of Israel's army. So to glorify the gory battle itself or its leader would be precisely the wrong attitude for both the participants and for the historian. And it would also be wrong for the reader to put emphasis on the brilliant battle strategy, or maybe for the exceptional courage and skill of the Hebrew warriors. So even though very little is said about these two battles between David and the Philistines as recorded in 2 Samuel chapter 5, the impact of David's victories represented a sea change in Israel's progress. And of course, it's the Lord who is given credit for these victories, because it's the Lord who won them before a single arrow was ever shot in anger. Now, one of the things that seems to have endeared David to God was his proper attitude in just these circumstances. The defeat of the Philistines caused David to exclaim in 2 Samuel 5:20, "Adonai has broken through my enemies for me, like a river breaking through its banks." And so the place where the battle was fought was named Baal Pratzim, the Lord of breaking through. I've already explained at length that at this point in Israel's history, the term Baal had been adopted into the Hebrew language and was often used simply to mean Lord. That name bore such an impact on Israel's history that we find it remembered even in Isaiah's day, 250 years later. Now, what we noticed back in chapter 5, verse 21, was that the Philistines had brought their gods with them into battle, just as the Israelites had brought the Ark of the Covenant into battle many years earlier. And the Philistine idols were captured, and then they were burnt up at David's order, just as the Ark of the Covenant was lost for a time to the enemy upon Israel's defeat several decades earlier. So let's move on now to 2 Samuel chapter 6, because it focuses on the Ark and on the story of David's attempt to make Yerushalayim not only Israel's political capital, but also its spiritual capital. So open your Bibles to 2 Samuel chapter 6. If you have a complete Jewish Bible, that's page 339. Again, David summoned all the picked troops of Israel, 30,000 men. And then David, taking along the entire force he had with him, then set out for Baal Yehudah to bring up from there the ark of God, which bears the name of Adonai Sephirot, enthroned above the cherubim. They set the ark of God on a new cart and brought it out of the house of Abinadab on the hill, with Uzzah and Achio, the sons of Abinadab, driving the new cart. And they led it from the house of Abinadab on the hill with the ark of God. Achio walked in front of the cart, and David and the whole house of Israel celebrated in the presence of Adonai with all kinds of musical instruments made of cypress wood, including lyres and lutes and tambourines and rattles and cymbals. And when they arrived at Nacon's threshing floor, the oxen stumbled, and Uzzah put out his hand to steady the ark of God. But Adonai's anger blazed up against Uzzah, and God struck him down on the spot for his offense, so that he died there by the ark of God. It upset David that Adonai had broken out against Uzzah. That place has been called Peretz Uzzah, breaking out on Uzzah, ever since. Now David was frightened of Adonai that day, and he asked, "How can the ark of Adonai come to me?" So David would not bring the ark of Adonai into the city of David. Rather, David took it over to the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite. And the ark of Adonai stayed in the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite for 3 months, and Adonai blessed Obed-Edom and all of his household. Now King David was told, Adonai has blessed the house of Obed-Edom and everyone who belongs to him, thanks to the ark of God. So David went and joyously brought the ark of God up from the house of Obed-Edom into the city of David. And when those bearing the ark of Adonai had gone only 6 paces, he sacrificed an ox and a fattened sheep. Then David danced, and he spun around with abandon before Adonai, wearing a linen ritual vest. So David and all the house of Israel brought up the ark of Adonai with shouting and the sound of the shofar. And as the ark of Adonai entered the city of David, Michal, the daughter of Saul, watching from the window, saw King David leaping, spinning before Adonai, and she was filled with contempt for him. They brought the ark of Adonai in, put it in its place inside the tent that David had set up for it. David offered burnt offerings and peace offerings before Adonai, and when David had finished offering the burnt offering and the peace offerings, he blessed the people in the name of Adonai Sephirot, and then he distributed to all the people of Israel, to everyone there, both men and women, a loaf of bread, a portion of meat, a raisin cake, after which the people all left for their homes. And when David returned to bless his household, Michal, the daughter of Saul, came out to meet him and said, "Such honor the king of Israel earned for himself today. He exposed himself before his servants, slave girls, like some vulgar exhibitionist." And David answered Michal, "In the presence of Adonai, who chose me over your father, over everyone in his family, to make me chief over Adonai's people, over Israel, I'll celebrate in the presence of Adonai. I'll make myself still more contemptible than that, and I'll be humiliated in my own eyes. But those slave girls you mentioned will honor me." Michal, the daughter of Saul, remained childless until the day she died. Well, about 7 decades had passed since the Ark of the Covenant rested in the Holy of Holies in the Tabernacle, as it should, according to the regulations of God as ordained in Mount Sinai. But now that Israel was again united in a political way, not seen since those 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, it was time to restore the ancient worship of Israel that had so badly and sadly become perverted and now nearly forgotten from the moment that Israel's collective feet touched those waters of the Jordan River at Joshua's leading. This could only happen when the Philistines were subdued, and when the place the Lord chose as where his name would dwell on earth came under Israelite control, Jerusalem. See, verse 1 explains that David assembled 30,000 men to go and fetch the Ark of God. And the complete Jewish Bible in this matter gets the vocation of these 30,000 men incorrect. They were not crack military troops, but rather they were the chosen political representatives of the whole land. They were the Bahar, the clan leaders, many prominent men from all the descendants of Jacob. And since the aim was to bring back the holiest object that had ever graced this planet, it was appropriate that a solemn procession that represented all Israel was convened to accompany that ark. Troops were not needed, although undoubtedly some went along as a normal precaution, because this was not a military expedition. The Philistines were confined to their Mediterranean seacoast territory at this moment. They were no longer a threat in Canaan. Further, the ark was not in the hands of the Philistines. It was in the hands of the Israelites, specifically in the care of a Levite family located at a place that is here called Baal Judah. The family was that of Abinadab, and he may have been a priest because his son's name was Eleazar, and that's a common name among the priestly clan. Later genealogies in the Bible also seem to imply that Abinadab was a priest. On the other hand, they could have been a family of ordinary Levites, non-priests. The reality is that the divinely ordained structure of the various offices and duties of priests and Levites had become blurred, mixed, applied kind of willy-nilly for quite a long time. So it's hard to know with any certainty just how it was arranged at this time. Now let's pause to recall the circumstances that directed the Ark of God to reside at its present resting place. In 1 Samuel 6:21, we read this. They sent messengers to the people living in Kiryat Yarim with this message. The Philistines have returned the Ark of Adonai. Come down and bring it back up with you. And then at 1 Samuel 7:1. So the men of Kiryat Yarim came and brought back the Ark of Adonai, and they took it to the home of Abinadab on the hill and appointed his son Eleazar to guard the Ark of Adonai. Now notice the name of this place is called Kiryat Yarim. Another name for it was Baal Judah, the Lord of Judah. And an earlier Canaanite name for this same place was Baalah. Now, place names can constantly shift in the Bible with the ebb and the flow of territorial control, evolution of languages. And we can be certain that these are all the same place because in the Samuel scroll that was found among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran, it specifically says so. Baal Judah is a small hilltop community located about 8 miles northwest of Jerusalem. So it would have been considerably less than a single day's journey for David and for Israel's leadership to travel to Abinadab's home. It's located at the confluence of the tribal territories of Judah and Benjamin, and in earlier times of Dan. But the name itself makes it clear that the place was considered as belonging to Judah. Now, the last part of verse 2 is a little confusing. So it's been translated in a number of different ways. It speaks of the ark, the name of God, and the cherubim on the lid of the ark. One interpretation seems to say that God's name, Yehovah, was literally written, carved above the cherubim. Another makes the passage to be an embellishing or glorification of the God whose ark it is. Another Hebrew sage sees it a bit differently. He sees it as an explanation of which God this ark represented. This matters, considering the reality that it was for a time in Philistine possession, had been stored away in a common home in an area controlled by the Philistines for the past 70 years, and Israel had only in an obtuse kind of way even practiced its religion for a very long time. One would think that what with the detailed instructions of the Torah on building the ark and so on, that it was self-evident that Yehovah was the God that was represented by this golden box with the winged representations of these spiritual beings, cherubim ensconced on its lid. But in fact, this is one of the few times in the Hebrew scriptures that God's formal name, Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh it's spelled, is directly attached to the ark and used in conjunction with the ark. And of course, this use of God's actual formal name is obliterated in both the Hebrew and English versions of the Bible, because in both cases, the 6,000 appearances of God's name, Yehovah, and the ancient scroll texts have been replaced with words like Adonai, Hashem, Lord, God, several different words. Thus, starting about 300 BC, due to some new traditions, even when the great Hebrew scholars read the Torah, to their minds, God's name wasn't even there. Nonetheless, the way this passage ought to be read is, David and all of the people that were there with him, they arose and went forth from Baal Judah to bring up from there the ark of Elohim, which is called by the name Yehovah of hosts, who is enthroned upon the cherubim. That's how it reads. In other words, the phrase Yehovah of hosts is enthroned upon the cherubim is being presented as an alternative name for the ark. Of course, what it really is a kind of revival statement, to recall that it's Israel's God alone who dwells above that ark, and that Israel's God's name is Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, Yehovah. And by the way, just to demonstrate how terribly the Lord's name has become obscured in both Judaism and Christianity, when we often see God called Adonai Sevaot in the Hebrew Bible, or the Lord of hosts in the English Bible, in fact, the original Hebrew says Yehovah Sevaot, or Yehovah of hosts. Almost always uses God's formal name in that title, not the more generic words Adonai, Lord, or anything else. Now, to transport the ark the 8 miles from Abinadab's home to the city of David, the ark was carefully set into a newly built ox cart. And it was accompanied by Uzzah and Achio, or said to be Abinadab's sons, although they could just as easily have been his grandsons, because very little distinction is made in the Hebrew thought in the Bible between sons and grandsons. And as they led that cart in procession, the 30,000 Bachar, the chosen men of Israel, walked along with David, celebrating the ark's reemergence with songs and dance and musical instruments. But when in verse 6, the oxen stumbled, and the cart lurched, and it tilted, and it appeared that the ark was about to tumble out of it, instinctively, Uzzah reached up to steady the precious cargo, and instantly he fell dead. This event so unnerved David that he now balked at bringing the ark into his compound, so he left it someplace else. And a great deal is going on here, so let's examine this episode piece by piece. There were a whole host of miscues and errors being committed on David's part that led to this fiasco. To begin with, the ark should never have been placed in an ox cart just because it was new. The Torah is very specific that not only should the ark be carried on the shoulders of men, but those men should be Levites, and specifically Levites of the clan of Kohat. Numbers 4:15 says, when Aaron and his sons have finished covering the holy furnishings and all the holy utensils, when the camp is about to move forward, then the descendants of Kohat are to come and carry them. They're not to touch the holy things so that they won't die. These things are the responsibility of the descendants of Kahat in the tent of meeting. And then in Numbers 7, 8, 9, verses 8 and 9, 4 wagons and 8 oxen he gave to the descendants of Merari in keeping with the needs of their duties, directed by Ithamar, the son of Aaron the priest. But to the descendants of Kahat he gave none, because their duties involved the holy articles which they carried on their own shoulders. Where in the world would Uzzah and Achio, who were Levites, maybe priests, or David, get the idea that the proper and solemn way to bring the Ark of the Covenant to the Israelite capital was in a new ox cart? Answer: from pagans. Let's once again refer back to 1 Samuel, to the story of the Philistines trying to get rid of the Ark of the Covenant because it had caused such death and devastation throughout the Philistine territory. Now I'm going to condense it by only examining the most pertinent verses. 1 Samuel 6, 1. The Ark of Adonai was in the country of the Philistines for 7 months. The Philistines summoned the priests and soothsayers and asked them, "What are we to do with this, the Ark of God? Tell us how to send it back where it belongs." Then jumping to verse 6. Why be obstinate like the Egyptians and Pharaoh were? When he had done his work among them, didn't they let the people go? And they left. Now take and prepare yourselves a new cart with 2 milk cows that have never been under yoke. Harness the cows to the cart, but put their calves back in the shed. Then take the Ark of Adonai and lay it in the cart. In a box next to it, put the gold objects you were sending back to him as a guilt offering. Then send it away to go off by itself. Skipping to verse 15. Then the Levites removed the Ark of Adonai and the box that was with it, which contained the gold objects, and put them on a big rock. Verse 21. Then they sent messengers to the people living in Kiriath Yearim with this message: the Philistines have returned the Ark of Adonai. Come down and bring it back up with you. 1 Samuel 7:1. So the men of Kiriath Yearim came and brought back the Ark of Adonai. They took it to the home of Abinadab on the hill and appointed his son Eleazar to guard the Ark. It's a sad commentary, and it's been well noticed by the Hebrew sages, that these Levites who were to accompany the Ark on behalf of King David, whose duty it was to not just know the Torah, but to teach it, had no idea how to treat it. Which means they had little to no knowledge of the law of Moses. So when 70 years after first receiving the Ark back from the Philistines, that time came to transfer the Ark to the city of David, it apparently was assumed that the right thing to do was to carry it there in the same manner it was brought to them, in an ox cart. And they figured that it must be a new cart that had never been used because it had a nice pious ring to it. Now, I can't help but be a little preachy here. Not too long, I hope. I've said on numerous occasions that the history and the development of Christianity and Judaism have run along parallel tracks, especially in how worship and observances are approached. Both groups started out with the pure word. Both groups were determined to stick to God's ordained ways at all costs. And then within one generation, they began to infect it with social customs, popular philosophies, and human doctrines because they felt comfortable. They felt familiar. It all fit in better with their worldview and their current circumstances. In a matter of 2 or 3 generations, the doctrines and traditions that arose from this mixture of the man-made with the divine became the norm. And most worshipers had no idea of what the original pure religion even looked like. Nor did they seem to care enough to find out. Judaism drifted in that direction. Modern Christianity's followed suit. The bulk of our modern Christian liturgy and customs has become this strange brew of Bible and then varying degrees of paganism mixed in with some modern social attitudes, resulting in something that I have no doubt that the earliest Christians, nor Paul, or Christ, would even recognize. Yet because the Holy Scriptures are today treated as entirely secondary to a sect or denomination's practices and teachings, most followers of the Messiah are blissfully unaware of just how far off the course we are as compared to what the Bible ordains for us. And of course, when we're confronted with such a startling suggestion that our worship practices and doctrines just might need to be re-examined, the dedicated layman and leader lash out in an unyielding defense of whatever their cherished personal traditions might be. You know, heaven forbid that an ordinary worshiper would point out the obvious in the Holy Scriptures to a church or a synagogue leader, because the common response might be something like, well, maybe you just don't belong here anymore. I mean, how easily modern believers recognize the corruption of God's laws among the biblical Hebrews in all the biblical eras, how quickly we jump to condemn them for it. But equally, how easily Christ's modern-day followers choose to turn a very disinterested eye towards God's commandments, and how quickly we excuse or rationalize away our own questionable practices, which are either unbiblical or even expressly forbidden in the Word. So those who organized and led this procession and put the Ark of God into a common wooden ox cart simply exercised what seemed right by Middle Eastern social convention and in their own eyes, without even bothering to consult or to consider God's written commandments on the subject. This would prove not only to be an embarrassing failure for King David, but a deadly one to one of the worshipers in particular. However, this wasn't the only indiscretion that David allowed in this adventure. The rabbis tell us that in this first attempt to bring the ark to Yerushalayim, the attitudes of everybody involved was completely wrong. And this is reflected in the contrast between the Hebrew words used to describe this first attempt versus the second one that went considerably better. Look at verse 5, because it says this, 2 Samuel 6:5. David and the whole house of Israel celebrated in the presence of Adonai with all kinds of musical instruments made of cypress wood, including lyres and lutes and tambourines and rattles and cymbals. The key word is celebrated, which in Hebrew is sachach. Sachach. And it means to laugh, to mock, to make merry, to jest, to joke, to be frivolous. That's what it means. To translate this word to celebrate isn't necessarily wrong, provided as readers we know that it's used in the sense of having a party. Sadly, some Bible translators so misunderstood this word that they attached it to the musical instruments and say that the house of Israel played sachach, musical instruments, which completely distorts the meaning of the verse. In David's second attempt to bring the ark to the city of David, which was a successful attempt, this is told beginning in verse 12, and it says, "So David went and joyously brought the ark of God up from the house of Obed-Edom into the city of David." But the operative word in this passage that is translated in English as joyously is the Hebrew word simcha. Simcha might sound a little familiar to you because at the end of the yearly cycle of reading through the Torah, Jewish synagogues celebrate with an observance that's called Simchat Torah. Simchat Torah speaks of an inner joy. It speaks of a gladness of the heart. It's similar to what Christians might call joy in the Lord. It's a pious kind of joy. It's a reverent kind of joy, as opposed to a raucous party atmosphere. So the second attempt to transport the ark was accompanied with much more proper respect. I'm afraid that especially since the 1960s, there has been a concerted effort within mainstream Christianity to move away from awesome reverence into comfortable familiarity with the Godhead. We now have the laughing good guy Jesus, who's our party buddy. The grandfather, the Father, the Creator. This grandfatherly God who winks at our indiscretions and looks the other way and tells us, don't be too concerned. And we have a Holy Spirit that's now with us to provide us with a warm, fuzzy feeling rather than with guidance and correction and holy enlightenment. Many good books have chronicled this fairly recent evolution of Christianity. And unfortunately, the purpose primarily revolved around the need to fill pews, to grow the church treasuries. And the strategy was to change God's image, to make him more likable, to make him more approachable on our terms, to make the obligations of believers, to make our duties towards God as no more than showing up for a weekly service and putting something in the plate. It's not unlike the modern view of education at our public schools that's more and more about lowering standards in order to move more kids through the system. David and the Levites and the elders of Israel all made this same grave error. Their cavalier attitude was that as long as they invoked God's name, why, they could proceed any way they chose. They had full liberty in the Lord. They thought that as long as they enjoyed the observance, and they felt good in their hearts about it, why, what else would God do but approve? They did what our modern religious institutions have done. They exchanged attention to God's holiness for the pursuit of their happiness. They even figured that the strictness of the law and the Torah were for their ancestors, not for them. And the third error that was made was mostly Uzzah's. Paid for it with his life. The Holy Ark is never to be touched with human hands under any circumstances. Metal rings were formed into that ark so that the carrying poles can be inserted, and these were not to be removed. The ark was to be covered with a cloth so that it couldn't be viewed, and also as a reminder, do not touch. Now let me remind you of a very basic Torah principle that was obviously simply laid aside in David's day. It's utterly forgotten in our time. Holiness is theoretically transferable by contact. The study is too extensive to review it here, so refer to some of the earlier Leviticus lessons to learn about how holiness and uncleanness are transferred from people to objects and objects to people and so on. But understand, this isn't superstition and it's not an abolished principle. Briefly, there are definite and well-defined laws in the Torah about the prohibition of anything holy coming into contact with something that's not. We also get some examples of what the consequences are if it's allowed. In Numbers 16, we get one of the most infamous events that happened during the wilderness journey out of Egypt, when a group of disgruntled men, led by the rebel Korah, decided that they had as much right inside that tabernacle compound as did God's priests. And so they brought their own personal fire pans with them to the tabernacle, and it resulted in two things. The fire pans touched holiness, and so they became holy, and the rebels were all killed. Numbers 16:35 to Numbers 17:3. Then fire came out from Adonai and destroyed those 250 men who had offered the incense. And Adonai said to Moses, tell Eleazar the son of Aaron, the priest, to remove those fire pans from the fire, scatter the smoldering coals at a distance, because they had become holy. Also the fire pans of these men whose sin cost them their lives have become holy, because they were offered before Adonai. Therefore have them hammered into plates to cover over the altar. This will be a sign for the people of Israel. There are two remedies for something that has become holy by means of unauthorized contact with a holy object. Either it's consecrated for use by God, or it's destroyed. Nothing in the middle. By touching the immeasurably holy ark of God, Uzzah instantaneously contracted a measure of holiness for which he, and nobody else for that matter, is authorized. So, he was destroyed. Should Uzzah have allowed the ark to tumble out of the cart onto the ground as he thought was going to happen? Short answer is yes. You bet. Assuming that God would even have permitted that to actually happen. See, this is a great example of what happens when we presume to take spiritual matters into our own hands in our own way. Our good intentions do not trump God's laws and commandments. And just so that we're together on this matter of contracting an unauthorized holiness is not a simple issue of committing a sin, like in Uzzah's case, or making a choice between committing the lesser of two evils. That choice only comes in matters between humans. In other words, committing the sin of lying to perhaps save an innocent life from unjust death is the lesser of two evils. But lying to God, or lying about God, that's a whole different thing. There are separate Torah laws about the relationship of humans to God and humans to humans. Now, one more thing and we'll wrap up tonight's lesson. Verse 6 explains that the procession with the ark had arrived at Nachon's threshing floor when this incident of Uzzah's death happened. And in verse 8, the name of the place seems to have been changed to Peretz Uzzah in commemoration of what happened there. Now first, let's look at the Hebrew Goren Nachon. Despite most translations, that makes it seem as though there was a man named Nachon who owned this threshing floor. But that's not the case. Goren means threshing floor, and Nachon means stroke or disaster. So Goren Nachon was merely a description of the place, not its name. But because of the incident, it was later given the name of Peretz Uzzah, meaning bursting out against Uzzah. We'll continue with that story next time. So please rise.